So this is the second part of today's event on the SiblingsToo Day, what parents need to know about sibling sexual abuse. And now I'm joined by Brad Watts and Spencer Bailey, and we're going to take away some of the myths and misinformation, particularly as it relates to sibling sexual abuse and the child who causes the harm, because we know that parents in particular have real concerns about not only their children being involved in some form of sexual problematic behavior, but also when they have a child who's been harmed and the person is causing the harm is also in the family, creates all sorts of different layers of concern and worry. But very briefly, Spencer, could you just tell us who you are, where you are, and what your professional expertise is?
Yeah, I'm Spencer Bailey. I'm a social worker and I work in England and the United Kingdom for a service that works with children and young people where there have been concerns about harmful sexual behaviour. And we receive referrals from various agencies, including the police, social services and schools. A large proportion of the referrals that we do receive is for young people who have sexually harmed or been accused to have sexually harmed siblings.
Great. Thank you, Spencer. And Brad Watts.
Yeah, Brad Watts here in the United States, in Tennessee. So I work as an outpatient therapist, treating severe trauma and particularly treating sibling sexual abuse cases, adolescent cases of sexual harm. And I work with families, work with individuals, work with survivors, work with those that have committed harm.
That's great. Thank you, guys. So we've spoken off camera, the three of us, and one of the things we all agree on is that sibling sexual abuse is not a form of child abuse that is, way off in the backwoods somewhere, hidden, in only a certain demographic or certain socioeconomic status. So sibling sexual abuse happens in any kind of family. Is that correct? What have you seen in your professional practice?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we work with a wide range of families, including those with parents who are in professional occupations. I mean, from research, it does tell us that sibling sexual abuse is more likely to happen in families who are facing other difficulties, but it can happen in any family, regardless of social or economic status. That's not a barrier to sibling sexual abuse occurring. So we see a wide range of families. I'm pretty sure that'll be the same experience for you as well, Brad.
Yeah, absolutely. It just runs across all kinds of demographics, whether it's race, whether it's socioeconomic levels, situations, two parents in the home, one parent in the home. But like you're right, Spencer, that's what I see in the research too. Certainly there's certain problems and things that go on that can make it more likely, but it certainly can happen in any home, and that's what we see.
Yeah, and it's important that we're not blindsided by thinking that this only happens in families with multiple problems. It can happen anywhere, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, just being open to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think one of the key myths about sibling sexual abuse is it's happening to that family down the street or on the other side of the tracks, or one that's loaded with other dysfunctions or difficulties, where in actual fact, across the board, we do see it in, mainstream high schools in the United States and all sorts of different places around the world. Statistics are from around the world. So given that you both have a lot of experience in dealing with the whole family, and particularly the person who has caused harm, the sibling who has caused harm, that's why I thought it best that you guys address these myths and misinformation, particularly about that person. But there are a lot of hurdles that parents need to get over and through in order to be open to this whole conversation. And I think that's probably accurately reflected by the first sort of questions that parents might ask you, or their fears that they express to you when they come through the door, when there has been a disclosure, has been a concern. So Brad, what do you usually hear when a family's coming through the?
Well, it's interesting because the concern isn't always easily voiced, but it's one that I know that they have. And sometimes there'll be some cajoling and they'll kind of tell me, this is really what I'm worried about. But it's the fact that they're afraid that, does this mean my child is going to be a pedophile? Are they a sociopath? They think of whatever kind of the headline of the notorious adult sex offender at the time, and they automatically kind of jump towards, what does this mean for my child's future? And are they going to be that way? And so, and that kind of, we call it deviance. So that's a real big concern that they typically have, that it's important to address right away with them.
Do you see the same thing, Spencer?
Yeah, I think just when it's sexual behavior, it causes a great deal of alarm and anxiety in families. I think that some families think, is my child going to be a sex offender? Is this child a sexual reprobate, or can this child be around other children? What does this mean for the child's future? And I think that's one of the big worries, really. And when it's happened within the family home, there's a particular taboo and stigma with intrafamilial sexual abuse or sexual abuse in a family setting. I think that sometimes exacerbates it as well. But what I would want to get across really is that sexual abuse does not necessarily, in a family setting, does not necessarily mean that there's been a sexual interest in children, that the child's got a sexual interest in children, in prepubescent children. In fact, most children we work with don't have any sort of deviant or paraphilic sexual interests. So that they don't have a sexual attraction to much younger children. It's just that the sexual behavior has happened in a family setting. There usually are many other reasons why this might have happened as well.
Well, there's the, some of the factors involved with sibling sexual abuse occurring are things like ease of access. The sibling has ease of access to the other sibling, and these sorts of things that just make it more, I don't want to use the phrase more likely, but it occurs easier because the other sibling is around all the time. So that would, as you sort of say, Spencer, just because one sibling is harming another sibling, they don't necessarily have an attraction to other siblings. It's just because they're easy to get to. It's an easy access thing.
Yeah, there's some unique circumstances when it's in a family setting. Availability and opportunity is certainly one of them. Siblings live in close proximity to each other, including in very private family spaces, bedrooms and bathrooms, which are the spaces where sexual abuse is most likely to take place. Also, it usually occurs with an older sibling against a younger sibling around about the onset of puberty. Not always, but that tends to be a trend. And it's a very confusing time, puberty, for all young people. They're discovering changes in the body. And I'm just trying to think of a young person that I worked with who had additionally, he was on the autism spectrum. He was on the autism spectrum, and he found it really confusing, all the changes that were happening in his body. And he really struggled in particular with impulsivity, and he just described this happening as something that just sort of sneaks up on him, and he didn't even know it was going to come, and it keeps getting me into trouble, this sort of thing, and he just wants to get rid of it. He wants to flush it down the toilet, were his words. He wanted to get rid of it. And so it was something that he didn't even understand why it was happening, but it was certainly probably had some link to the impulsivity difficulties associated with autism, and his confusion about puberty as well.
Well, that impulsivity that you're talking about, I think it is, again, one of the myths and one of the confusing things for parents is that we do tend to look at the subject of sexual abuse through the eyes of adults. Oh, they must have planned this. They must have been, really scheming to get into it. But like you say, autism spectrum or not, I would imagine some of the comments are, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't fully understand. It wasn't sitting, in the side room somewhere necessarily scheming out this whole plan like we tend to think of adult perpetrators. So that's one of the myths, isn't it? That the sibling is quite devious, and yes, there's misrepresentation and some deviousness about what they're doing, but the motivations are different. Is that not correct?
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about sort of younger or mini adult sex offenders. These are young people who are still developing. A lot of that development doesn't finish until the early to mid 20s. So that gives a lot of hope and optimism for change, but also means that actually these behaviors that are happening are not fixed. That they've got something wrong. It's very serious, but we need to give them that opportunity to change and that opportunity to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And we can't write them off because of this sexual behavior that's happening.
Right. What are some of the other myths, Brad, that people associate with someone who has perpetrated harm against another sibling in terms of this sexual behavior? What are some of the other?
Yeah, so one of the other ones is just feeling like, oh, they're disordered. I.e., there has to be something wrong, with them, and something in the brain, or whatever the case may be. There's some kind of medical disorder that needs to be placed on them. This is why they did it. So I've encountered clients where they've been sent to, medical doctors, write some kind of prescription for them to make them stop doing that. And that just does nothing, that's not true. it's a myth that, committing sexual harm within the sibling relationship, it's a behavior and a choice. It's not a disorder. And I think it's important for people to remember that. And kind of like what Spencer's talking about, for parents, brain development is a really important thing to understand, to just look at those differences. And again, just treatment, it's really working on some of these deficits that that kind of can lead into that.
What do you mean by deficits?
Well, it can be, different kinds of social deficits. It can be just deficits in sexual understanding, healthy sexuality, and not having an understanding of that, understanding what consent is. And again, just kind of those impacts. Empathy is always a big focus in what we're working on in treatment, trying to get them to look at things from not only a survivor's perspective, but family members who are victims or survivors of secondary trauma that goes on. And those are things that kids at 12 to 14, kind of like what Spencer's talking about, is where the research shows that where this really ramps up. They're not thinking about that kind of stuff. So it's really working on that, working on consent, understanding those kinds of things, among others.
And
I absolutely agree with that. And I think one of the things, if we ask the young people what they want after this huge sort of bombshell has gone off in the family, they nearly always say they don't want to sexually harm their sibling, that they want to have healthy consensual relationships with young people of their own age, and they want this to go away. They feel very bad about it. They might not be able to fully express that, but the last thing they want is for this to be happening in the family, and they want a healthy, safer future. And that's what we'll really focus on and work on in the interventions and therapeutic support we provide.
And that sort of reinforces the idea that these are not sexual offenders, quote unquote, like we think of adult offenders, because they have quite often, the person causing harm does have those feelings of remorse and confusion and a real desire to have healthier relationships. They just don't know. And you were saying earlier, Brad, about things like brain development. This is a key factor in this whole conversation about sibling sexual abuse, isn't it? Is the stages of brain development are, I mean, most parents don't understand the stages of brain development generally. And why would you? It's not a class we have in high school. Yeah. So, we don't really have access to this information. So that could be another reason why parents go to, through their filter of adults, as my child is an adult offender, when in actual fact they're not, because of these things that you've just been saying. But one of the things that you said earlier, Spencer, and you said as well, Brad, is that, there might be some quote unquote dysfunctions going on in the family that may be under, may cause or may be part of sibling sexual abuse occurring in the family. That doesn't mean that all dysfunction in a family breeds sibling sexual abuse, and we certainly wouldn't want to send that message, because as far as I'm concerned, pretty much every family is dysfunctional in some way. But what are some of the things that you often see when it comes to, stuff going on in a family and sibling sexual abuse is also there? What sort of dysfunctions would you say are there?
I mean, it could be abuse, trauma, or loss in the many guises that takes, really. And I think that sometimes sexual behaviors, not always, but particularly in younger children as well, sometimes sexual behaviors might be a way of the children, in an unhealthy way, really meeting emotional needs that have not been met or have been missed during early childhood development. So I'm thinking of some brothers that I worked with who had grown up in quite a frightening home, when the mother and the ex-partner were having going through divorce, and they used to get into bed with each other and comfort each other, and that sometimes turned into sexual touching as well. And whether it was the sexual behavior, whether it had a sexual motive, is unclear. It could also have a sort of a role in providing emotional comfort and support and nurturance, really, as well. So I'm not saying that's the case in all children where there's been sibling sexual abuse, but we have to look at what the function of the sexual behavior was. Was it entirely sexual? Was it meeting some emotional, unmet emotional needs at the time as well? And we really have to remember that these are children as well who may act out sexually, but there may be other underlying unmet needs for them as well.
Mm-hmm. Brad, your thoughts?
Yeah, again, similar stuff. I mean, what we see, or what I see a lot, and the research backs this up too, is things like domestic violence, maltreatment. Those things have really big impact. Certainly, sexual abuse has an impact as well, but a lot of times we just feel like it's always sexual abuse, and that's not necessarily the case. Just even witnessing, physical abuse in the home can play a big role, and then like what Spencer's saying, a lot of those unmet needs, not getting that support. Maybe it's just a single mom, working 2 jobs, and the kids are apart a lot. You've got what we tend to call a parentified child. A child that's usually maybe 4 or 5 years older than younger siblings, who's treated like a little adult, is exercising authority over those kids. That can play roles in it. And it's varied, as we know, and as we've learned, those of us that work in this and have lived, it just comes, those situations are different. Every case is a little bit different, and that's important, to remember just on the specifics, but there certainly are trends, and those are trends that we do see.
Yeah, and I'll just emphasize the same, really, is that we can't sit the child down and say, why did you do it? They probably won't give you an answer, and they probably don't know themselves as well. There's probably multiple contributory factors relating to past loss or trauma, social communication difficulties, like we've talked about before, availability and opportunity of access to a sibling, puberty, and even things like low self-esteem and difficulties in peer relationships as well. There could be a constellation of reasons that this has happened, and it's unlikely we'll ever be able to pick one single cause. There's usually multiple reasons, and we can hypothesize and come up with reasons why it might have happened. Ultimately, the goal and the focus is on how can we keep this child and the whole family safe in the future, really.
One of the things that I wanted to touch on in this conversation is really and we spoke about this before, is the role and the dynamics of the family. And what I'm hearing you both say is that it is quite often a player in some of the underlying causes of sibling sexual abuse, but also I think we need to emphasize that the role of the family and the dynamic of the family is very much, front and center in the solutions to sibling sexual abuse, to the treatment and to the opportunities that need to show up for a family to move through and say past sibling sexual abuse. So can we just talk about the role of the family here a bit in the dynamic then of resolving issues around sibling sexual abuse and supporting both the child who's been harmed, who needs a great deal of support as well. We don't want to miss that conversation, though we are discussing it in other aspects of today's event, but also in the role of the family and the parents in supporting the person who has caused the harm. So Spencer, earlier off mic, you were talking about, and Brad, you were agreeing that professionals have a role to play, but it is the family who is actually the lead in the next steps after disclosure, after something happens. Can you guys speak a bit more to that, please?
Yeah, certainly I think parents, the family, are front and center of this family healing and moving on. If the sexual harms occurred in the family setting, that needs to be the place where, in most circumstances, where the repair and restoration occurs, really. This is not just sexual harm, it's usually emotional harm and damage to family relationships, and that's where we need to focus the work, and that's why parents have the key role in restoring those relationships between siblings and between all family members. What I would say is that it's quite common for initial reactions from parents once there has been sibling sexual harms being discovered is for extreme and conflicting responses such as shock, disbelief, rage, despair and confusion. And some people might describe, I remember one family saying that they don't know whether to kill or hug the son that did this. How do we respond to this? It's affected everyone. And it's really important to recognize the impact it has on parents as well. We can't expect parents to just have their act together and be able to respond to it straight away. This is a huge shock for them as well, and they need to have the right support in place.
Brad?
Yeah, it's critical. It's essential. The role of parents, particularly once it's disclosed. And I tell my parents that I work with to get their own therapy. They need to be in therapy, processing through this, through a lot of the reasons Spencer's talked about. But yeah, they're just blindsided. It's so incredibly difficult. The term has been used. It's like a family earthquake. But the best results come through the family. So if it's just a kid that's committed sexual harm and he's doing his treatment independent of that, or if it's a survivor doing treatment independent of that, your results are obviously going to be, less, I guess you'd say, and not optimum as what we want, as opposed to addressing it in the family. And that's just why it's so important, one, for parents to take action, to get their own therapy, and then to make sure that the kids are getting therapy. And too often we forget about the siblings that at least that aren't involved. So let's say they didn't suffer any sexual harm, they weren't involved in it. It was two other siblings. Too often they are neglected, and so that's why taking a family systems approach, just looking how important getting treatment for everyone within the family is.
Mm. I was speaking with another one of the speakers in today's event, the Siblings 2-day event, about this subject, though he will be speaking to a different one later. And he was talking about how in his professional practice in the center that he works in, there are times when parents who have had disclosure, who originally rocked to their core, a year or two later, after therapy for everybody, after they go through a process and all that sort of stuff, the parent actually comes back originally talking about how desperate they were. They now come back talking about how proud they are of their kids, that all the kids, because of the system that they were in terms of support, were able to sort of learn and grow and create different kinds of relationships that were healthy and mature. I found it interesting how, at point A, if there's been disclosure and discovery of sibling sexual abuse, as you say, earthquake in the family, or a little bomb goes off in the middle of the family, but then with the right intervention and support for the whole family, a year or two or less or whatever, you've got parents talking about how proud they are of their family, of themselves as parents and of their kids, and how they show up. Has that been your experience as well with the families you've worked with?
Yeah, and I think it's important that we don't ignore what's happened, the harm that's caused, and that, with appropriate support in place and with appropriate responses from parents, family life will move on. The family will heal and repair. It might not return to how life was. There might need to be some fundamental changes to boundaries and to how siblings communicate and interact with each other. But there is a future, and things will get better. One of the things that we do know from research is that parents have a key role in the effective engagement of the child who has been accused of harm. We know that most children that have been accused of harm remain at home, and we know that knowledgeable and supportive parents are the most effective in responding to sibling sexual abuse. So if the parents have the support in place for them, they're able to then support the child who's harmed, but also the child who has been harmed and the non-harmed siblings as well. So we really need to make sure that support's in place for everyone. This needs a united response, a joined up response. It's not something, like Brad said before, that can just be responded to with individual children.
I like your emphasis too on parents being knowledgeable and equipping themselves, and even if sibling sexual abuse doesn't occur in one's family, which we hope it does not, but even if it doesn't, being educated about sibling sexual abuse, which is what this whole day is about, is helping parents who have only maybe vaguely heard of sibling sexual abuse or sibling trauma or sibling incest or whatever, become more knowledgeable, understand more about what's happening, not only so that they can perhaps take preventative steps, but just so that they're more confident in how they're dealing with their families. So, as you say, the research shows that the person who has caused harm is not likely to reoffend, particularly with intervention, and that with supports and with everybody getting what they need, a healing journey can be quite successful for the whole family. Brad, would you add to that?
Yeah, what you look at too is a lot of times when sibling sexual abuse does come forward, it's exposing kind of fault lines, cracks, so to speak, in the foundation that maybe were glossed over in the past. And so you can't necessarily go back and what Spencer's talking about, this is the way it was, we're going to return to the way it used to be. It's a new normal that you have to set up, and a much better situation where people feel hopefully safer, particularly survivors and others, and that there's greater respect of boundaries, there's greater function there, because often there's different kinds of dysfunction that's going on that they can lead to, and so it's just to re-strengthen or to strengthen the family in that regard. And that's why it's so important that it's addressed within the family, where we have buy-in from all members of the family and participating in family sessions. That's why it's important to bring siblings together in therapy as soon as they're ready. Obviously, you go through, make sure it's safe, and there's some markers that we go through with that. But as opposed to just writing letters that are never sent or doing those kinds of things, allowing them to come in and to address that together face to face in a supportive environment.
And as we come to the sort of end of this particular conversation for now, and there'll be a lot more information in the resource pack that the people who have registered for today can download later. As we wrap up, thinking about the parents that are listening that are not necessarily familiar with sibling sexual abuse and are looking at today's event to increase their understanding, maybe take some preventative steps. You both work with families where sibling sexual abuse and other problematic sexual behaviors have occurred. What sort of message would you send to another parent or the parents who are listening about not being in denial and not just turning their head and not thinking this is going to happen in their home? What sort of message would you send to them? A message of optimism, but also of, empowerment, and this is a real thing. You do need to deal with it. So Spencer, I'm going to throw you on the button first.
No, certainly. I suppose what we know from research and practice with young people who have been in long-term treatment for following sibling sexual abuse is that there were, and these are the more serious forms of sexual abuse where it's usually had police or court involvement, that there were opportunities for family, but also for professionals to have intervened earlier on. So that's not to attribute any blame, and hindsight's not particularly helpful. But what it does recognise is that the importance of prevention. We need to act on suspicions. If we've got a hunch or a niggling worries or doubts, we need to sort of question that, not just ignore it, that recognise that sibling sexual abuse is always a possibility, and to really go on your instinct really and have those ongoing conversations about privacy, about respect, boundaries, okay and not okay touching, and providing opportunities for your individual child to tell by having individual time to talk to them and seeing them on their own. So it's really those sort of prevention messages around making sure that everybody knows what's okay or not okay and having respect for each other, but also about being able to have those open, honest conversations with individual children as well.
Brad?
Yeah, that it's critical to take action, because as we see, working in this and survivors like yourself experiencing it, by not taking action, it can literally mean the disintegration of the family versus that the hopeful message is if they take action, as difficult as it is, as we know, there is a path forward, and healing does take place and can take place, but you need to take action. It's that first step. I think it's the hardest step for parents, just to admit to themselves, once they get through the shock of what they've heard or seen or have experienced, like what Spencer's saying. In my experience, most parents have that feeling, have that kind of gnawing feeling, hey, I saw this, and just the importance of taking action. But to know that these are kids, it's a whole lot different than with adults, and that there is a path forward, and there are people here to help, and that so they don't have to carry that burden alone. I think that's one of the great messages of what we're trying to do today, and that we are here to help, we are trained, and that your family can heal, and it can come out on the other end strong and vibrant, and that the young people that have committed sexual harm, they can go on and live great, productive, successful lives. They can have healthy relationships, even with their other siblings and siblings that they've committed sexual harm, through paying the price of going to treatment and doing the hard work that's necessary.
I think probably for this particular section of today, that sort of message is a great message to end on, because I do want the audience to feel not only there is an importance to learning about sibling sexual abuse, but we can also have elements of hope and optimism when we're thinking about this, because usually, of course, this sort of subject is just all doom and gloom, and families are destroyed and human beings are destroyed and all the rest of it. But you're both putting across a strong, experienced message of that is not the case. That doesn't necessarily mean, if there's been a disclosure, that the family is done. So I think that's an ideal message to finish on, the one of knowledge and also of hope and optimism. So I thank you both for your time today.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Spencer.
Thank you, Retta.